Well, as we begin this morning, I found something humorous about this lady that got a new job working as a secretary in the security offices at an international airport. And this is an important job, and she's actually a little bit nervous about, being in there. One day, she noticed she'd only been there maybe a couple of days, and a couple of security guards brought a man into this interrogation room, put him in the room, and it was directly across the hall from her desk. And so she's watching this intently. It's the first time she's seen it, wondering what's going on. All of a sudden, some other emergency happens somewhere else in the airport. The officers come running out of the room, and they take off and disappear down the hallway, failing to lock the door behind them as they left. And so she got really nervous. Who's this guy in this room, and what do they have him in there for? And she's watching, and sure enough, a few minutes later, the door kind of opens up. The man walks out and begins walking down the hall. And she knew she had to do something, so she's just shaking and trembling, but she musters up all the courage she has, and she stands up, and he says, "Hey, you, stop right there and get back in that room." Scared the man, and he complied. He goes back into the room, and he locks the door behind him. A few minutes later, the guards show back up, and she tells them everything that had happened and how she barked these orders at the man, and he went back in, and he's inside. He's still in the room now. And the officer told her, says, "Well, okay, thank you, and I think we'll let him go now since he's just a frightened telephone repairman." All right. Well, there you go. So, hey, this is the last message in our series called Turn Up the Heat. And as we have gone through this, I hope you've been challenged. I hope you've maybe learned something or saw something differently. And you're ready just to take your faith up a notch. What does that look like for you this year? Obviously inspired by our weather. Notice that ever since we began this series, the temperature outside has been progressively going up. I appreciate the Lord for backing me up on that. But now that it's over, I'm fearful that maybe we're heading back. I don't think winter's quite done yet, so brace yourselves. But how can you step it up? How could you go that extra mile? Give it more effort. How can you lean into the Lord? And what his calling is upon your life. We've looked at 4 areas already. Today will be the last one, but just a real quick review. We talked about stand up. How to stand strong in the faith, especially maybe in an area or a time when our culture's changing and it's difficult to stay strong. It's easy to drift away. It's easy to get caught up in distractions. So instead, give ourselves to godliness and give ourselves to the work in the Word of God. Second, we said step up. This is a message on leadership and responsibility. What does it look like for you to step up into areas of representing God in your life, in your marriage, in your home, maybe amongst coworkers, maybe in your neighborhood? Where are the opportunities where you could step up and get involved and take ownership of things in your life? I was watching a thing this last week, and Mike Foster is a counselor and trainer, and he talked about that. He said, you are ridiculously in charge of your own life. You are ridiculously in charge of your own life. And if you want things in your life to go better, then what is your personal responsibility in making sure that happens? How can you watch for areas and ways to take the lead and so on? Okay, the third one was speak up. And it was a message on how to easily and effectively share our faith. It was just one message, something that we've said sometimes becomes a whole series, a whole thing, and we can make it so complicated. We looked at a couple of ways that we can just speak up for the Lord. Things like looking for opportunities, seeking God's leading in our lives. What promptings might He make available to us? How can we just understand the grace of God and be gracious amongst others and what that does in the world around us? In fact, we're going to unpack that more today. And then lastly, how to share just the blessings that God has given to you. When we share God's blessings, it is a way for us to shine the light into the world. Last week we talked about stay humble. What a challenge. To stay humble, learning to live a life of self-reflection and repentance before the Lord. What that does in us and how that changes us. We cannot grow into any of these other areas until we're willing to submit our life before the Lord. Guide me, Lord. Teach me. I'm open. I'm ready. Okay, today's the last one. Calling it Serve the King. And what it's really about is, in order to serve the King, we have to learn how to give up a little bit on ourselves. We have to fight that temptation of selfishness and learn how to live for Him. It's surrendering to God. There was another story I found this week. 2 a.m., the phone rings at the mansion of the governor's house. And some kind of, aide, orderly, whatever, waiter, he answers the phone and takes the call, and it's a local attorney. And he insisted he needed to speak to the governor immediately. And the aide argued with him, says, it's 2 a.m, I cannot wait the governor, you're going to have to call back tomorrow. He says, no, this is a matter of utmost urgency. It cannot wait. Please wake him up. I need to speak to him. And he just, the aide reluctantly decided to wake up the governor because of this attorney's, forceful impression upon him. So the governor answers the phone. He says, who is this? And the attorney says, well, he says, Governor, Judge Cassidy just died, and I want to take his place. Well, the governor couldn't believe it, and he says, well, that's okay with me if it's okay with the undertaker. By all means, take his place, please. That selfishness that drives me. I want to take care of my wants, my wishes, my ambitions, my desires, my direction. How can I serve myself? And it's such a powerful force within us that we have to address, we have to look at, we have to ask how we can deal with this. We're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 2 today. I'd encourage you to open up there. And this is another time where we're going to read a few of these verses. So you'll want to keep it open and follow along, and we'll refer back. Before we read it, you're going to want a couple things in your mind, because this is a time when the Apostle Peter writes this book, hence the title there. Peter writes this book, which it was really a letter that was sent out to Christians, and it seems as though it was kind of one of these traveling letters that would be passed around. But this time it didn't go to town, to church, like some of the other letters of the New Testament did. This one was probably sent to leaders specifically, and that's because this was a time of oppression and persecution on the church. Rome had increased its offensive against the church, was trying to stop the church, shut the church down. And so this is a time of persecution. This is a time of exile where Christians and leaders are hiding in different areas. You can look back at chapter 1, and it talks briefly about this. And so the Roman government is oppressive and persecuting the church. The church is living in exile. And so essentially, Peter writes this letter to the leaders of the church, and then by extension, the brothers and sisters of the church. And he basically is telling them, I know that these times are difficult. And because of that, I want you to learn how to surrender to God and your circumstance. So, warning before we proceed. Just about everything in this message is going to offend your sense of justice and right and wrong. Your sense of, but that doesn't seem like that's right or the way things ought to be. It doesn't make sense. And it's difficult to understand how Peter would write these words to the church at that day. I mean, don't we want to have the kind of message that says, hey, hang in there, God's about to rescue you. Hang in there, God's going to set everything right. Hang in there, your suffering is just about over. Your struggle is almost through. Hang in there because a brighter, better day is just around the corner. But this letter is a little bit more along the lines of, I know things are hard. But how you struggle, how you suffer, what you do demonstrates how you surrender to God. And you need to make a choice today. Are you going to surrender yourself and the selfishness that battles within you and serve the Lord, or something else? So let's look at 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning down with verse 13, as he writes. Verse 13 says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor." So how do we serve the king? We'll take a quick break and ask that question. We serve our king when we learn how to surrender to authority. Now this is difficult. Verse 13 started off with this idea of being subject to every human institution. Now I know this brings up all kinds of competing ideas. When we think about submitting to our government, or submitting to your boss, or submitting to your supervisor, or submitting to some organization that has leadership in it, submitting to whatever group you're part of, there's always going to be leaders. There's always going to be people who are in charge, and submitting to those institutions is a real challenge. We would even probably tend to want to argue against this because we all have experiences or knowledge of things when that are not going right, and the injustice of it seems unbearable. We all have stories about how those liberals are doing whatever. We all have stories about exceptions to this kind of scenario when a leader or somebody stood up and raged against the machine, if you will. Are we just supposed to be the doormats of the world? I've heard that question so many times. Are we supposed to just be the kind of Christians that lay down when oppression comes our way? What about the Crusades? What about racial injustice and how those that rose against that changed our country? And I understand these are tough questions. What are we to do with all this? I merely present two thoughts. One is what the text says. And two, the cultural context in which this text was written. When an oppressive government was at this point not only trying to stop the church, scatter the church, but even fatally ending the church when they could. The second thought is that during Peter's day, while they were under this Roman rule and this strict oppression, in the mind of the Jew, it was important to them to not accept any king except God. That's what they thought, they believed, and they've been taught their entire life. You have no king except for God. And so Peter comes along and writes to them that every Christian should be good citizens and submit to their government, the kings that are over them. Why? Well, the text says a couple things for us to consider. One, when you surrender to authority, it demonstrates your service to God. It demonstrates that you are submitting to God. You're submitting to Him, and you want to use your life to demonstrate that you belong to the Lord. In other words, it helps our witness. It establishes that we belong to God. When we surrender to the governing authorities, to the leaders over us, because we first surrendered to the Lord. Verse 15 says that it is the will of God that we do this. So we are showing that we're surrendered to Him, but then it goes on to say, and it puts to silence the ignorance of foolish people. You know, it seems like we live in a day when the church has gotten tired of talking about our witness. Back when I was growing up in the church, everybody said, "Oh, don't do that, don't do that. It hurts your witness." You know, when you go to you can't go to a movie theater because they don't know what movie you went to see. You can't play playing cards because people might think you were gambling. You can't do, there's all these kinds of things, and the rationale behind it, which is certainly worth considering, was what example are you to the world around? What is your example? Who do you want to be, and how do you want to show the world you are in your actions, in your attitudes, in how you talk, and certainly the things that you did? The problem is that when we focused on those things, we missed what God said would be our best example of our witness. And sometimes we failed to talk about things like gossip and slander and murmuring, which is complaining. These are the things that hurt your witness, according to Scripture. Your representation of Jesus Christ in how you act and what you say and how you live. So when we surrender to authorities around us, it demonstrates that we are surrendering into service unto God. Second of all, it demonstrates the grace from God. It went on to say that we should honor everyone, even honoring the emperor at this time, if I can refer back. An emperor that was not on their side and was not doing them favors. To show respect to people, whether they deserve it or not, can be a tough pill to swallow. But what he's saying is that it represents grace when we do so. Look down at verse 19. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. When we show grace to people that do not deserve it, it demonstrates the grace of God that's been shown to us first, when we didn't deserve it. When we choose to go beyond what's normal or expected. And of course, thinking back to Jesus' day, when a Roman soldier can come up to a Jew and didn't matter what they were doing, what they had going on, didn't matter what your schedule was, but a soldier could come up and say, "Drop that now, you're going to go with me and you're going to carry my equipment for me, because I got to march from here to there. I'm going somewhere. You've got to help me carry my stuff." Abandon your family, abandon your job, abandon your responsibility, abandon what you have going on. And by law, they could force a Jew to go 1 mile and carry their equipment. And Jesus says, well, when they ask you to do that, you know what you should do? Is you should go 2 miles. It shows grace. It shows character. Does your boss deserve grace? When other employees are all talking about how awful this person is and how they don't understand what's really going on, they don't see and they don't do anything about it? Does our president, our emperor, deserve grace when we talk about him? I really try that the way I talk about President Trump is exactly the way I talked about President Obama, is exactly the way I talked about President Bush, President Clinton, and so on. To the best of my ability, I want to honor our emperor. Do other people in your life that lead in some capacity deserve grace when you talk about them behind their back? When you're in that group and you're sharing these thoughts and ideas and you're speaking of who they are? Maybe they don't deserve it. But isn't that the nature of grace? giving what is not deserved, watching your tongue, watching your words, watching your attitudes, so that you can demonstrate the grace of God is within you. Verse 20 goes on and says, and think about it, this is kind of tough. What credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? I mean, you got what you deserved, right? But if when you do good and suffer for it and you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Then look down at what it says in verse 21. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, it says, so that you might follow in his footsteps. It shows grace in how we were given what we did not deserve. Lastly, it demonstrates community for God. Honor everyone, it says. It helps us to be a better society. It helps us to get along with the conditions and the situation in which we live. I was talking with a friend about all the animosity that has risen in the last year or two against police officers. And I don't know that we've seen a lot of this in our area, although it's happened. But I thought all these movements and all these marches and all the things that have gone out against police officers. And I thought, so then what happens when we completely emasculate our defenders in our community and then we need them? When something goes wrong and you need them to show up and that badge has to stand for something. The authority they have has to mean something. I remember down in California, I watched an officer was cornering this guy, and it was kind of a guns drawn type situation, and it was right out in front of our house, actually in front of Grayson's house, there next door to the church. And then there was these other 20-something, there's a whole group of people, and they're just yelling at the officers, "Oh, you stupid pig, what's wrong with you? Go!" They're just going on, and I thought, here's this officer, no backup. An angry mob all around him. He has to rely upon his authority to control the situation. And this is across the street from a park where children play, in a neighborhood full of homes. We need them to have power. Do they misuse that at times? Is there bad ones? Yeah, probably happens. But we need them to help protect our society. In other words, submission to authority, to leadership, helps to create the best society possible under the conditions that we have. I would hope that none of us believe that total anarchy is the way to solve the problems in our country. What we believe is, I have the right to anarchy. Nobody else does. I just have that right. But what we really need for our nation is we need stability, and we need prosperity, and we need things to work. And so we take the situation, the culture, the leadership that we have, and to the best of our ability within that, when we submit to authority, it helps things to go better. And it helps us to trust that the Lord is at work somewhere in the middle of it. Second of all, we serve our King when we surrender to sin. Look at verse 23. It says, when he was reviled, this is talking about Jesus now, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges unjustly, or who judges justly, speaking of God. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Do you understand that sin is almost entirely about selfishness? One way or another, sin says, I am better at meeting my needs than God is. I'm in charge of my needs and not God. I know what's better for myself and not God. And so I'm going to take care of it myself. Or similar to that, it can also say that my needs are more important than anyone else. What I want, what I think is right in life, I can take and go for that instead. 2 Timothy 3, 1-5 says, in the last days there will come times of difficulty. Why? It says, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient. There's a whole other list of selfish attitudes and activities in this. And then at the end it says, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. All the sins, greed and pride and lust, jealousy, all the sins come back to selfishness. W.F. Adney, Christian author, wrote, Christianity requires the eradication of selfishness. So long as a man thinks only of himself, he has not learned what the gospel means. We cannot serve the king if we continue in sin. Jesus did not come to make us free to sin, but to set us free from sin. I found a story about a marriage proposal. And have you heard different stories of how, he popped the question? You might think back as when that happened to you. Mine wasn't really so brilliant. I kind of blew it. I blew it. I was starting to formulate a plan, and I went to a jeweler and picked up an application for a loan for a ring. I went to buy the ring, right? And so I wanted to get the ring. And I had the application and at my house there, I had it all filled out and ready to go. And before I could take it back, it was a Sunday afternoon. It was after church. Sandy came over to the house after church. It was I was still living with my parents at that time, so we had a lunch and all this. She finds the application, and she says, "Well, what is this for?" And and I'm thinking, "Oh, now what do I say? How do I hide this? How do I not answer or whatever?" And not lie at the same time, right? And I'm just trapped. And so finally I didn't know what else to do, and she persisted, and I told her, well, it was an application to buy an engagement ring. And of course, and then she got real excited. And so then, a couple hours later, we're actually driving back to church. We had church that evening. We're driving back here to church, and I said, oh, by the way, I guess I should ask you if you really want to marry me. So there was my proposal. How romantic. Hey, it worked, Others have done better, and we've heard stories of sunsets and mountaintops and perfect, carriage rides, all that kind of thing. I read a story this week about another young man. He did a little bit better job, although took a different approach. He took his hopefully soon-to-be fiancée out to dinner, and they had this candlelight dinner together. And it came to that moment when he was going to pop the question, and he gets down on a knee. His gal got so excited. I mean, she kind of was figuring out what was coming, and she got so excited. She just knew this was the magical moment he's going to ask. And instead, a surprise turn of events, he had hidden a basin of water in a towel, and he pulls it out. And he proceeded to take and remove her shoes. And he washed her feet. And obviously, they were believers. And when he finished, he asked her, he said that he was ready to lay down his life, the rest of his life, and would she let him spend his days serving her. How many don't understand what marriage really is? But here's a young man that was kind of getting the picture. How many young people get married for very selfish reasons? And they don't understand at all what it means to lay down their life and what it's going to require to be happy in that relationship. We serve our King when we learn how to surrender to the selfishness of sin. We learn to serve our King when we surrender to authority. And third, we learn how to serve our King when we surrender to ambition. Now, we're going to have to think on this one just a moment. That may seem shocking. That may seem terribly counter thoughts to everything else that we hear about. And actually, I want to say, ambition is not wrong. Passion is not wrong. Hard work, perseverance, I don't think is wrong. There's so many other places in the Bible it talks about how we need to have all these things. But we do have to ask ourselves who and what our ambition is for. Is it our own status? Is it our own pride and ego? Is it so that we look good? Is it so that we can build a certain identity around our accomplishments? Are we building our own kingdom or God's? Is the ambition to build for ourselves, or is our ambition to build for Him? Do you want God's things, or do you only want your own things? Now, I think that we need to see this throughout the entirety of the passage. The passage doesn't really say, surrender your ambitions. Yet when it talks about surrendering to Christ, when it talks about giving ourselves over to the will of God, it's starting to paint this picture that even if it means suffering and endurance and sacrifice, it matters because we recognize that our lives are for the purpose of serving the King and His kingdom. And we can lay down what we lose in the process if we're willing to give up our selfish ambitions. But to finish out this chapter, look at verse 25. It says, "For you were straying like sheep, but now return to the shepherd and the overseer of your soul." There was a group of Americans that went on safari in Africa, true story. And they had gone and they were going to see the country. They wanted to see the animals. This was a multi-day trek across the open wilderness there, and to experience all this. And they had guides with them. And when they had set this up, these guides would carry all the gear and equipment. They set up the camp. They tear down the camp. They cook. They do all this, and you just go along for the ride. And very exciting trip. And they set out, and the Americans just wanted to see how many miles they could trek. They wanted to see how much country they could see. They're very excited, and so they pushed ahead really hard the first day. Day 2 comes. They push ahead really hard the second day. Day 3 comes. They push ahead really hard. They wanted to get up early. They wanted to go, way into the night. They wanted to just, see and accomplish all that they could. They get down to the 4th day of all this, and after breakfast, all the guys just go and sit under the shade of a tree. And so they're trying to be patient, and they're anxious to get going. 9 o'clock comes. 10 o'clock comes. They start murmuring, hey, we're burning daylight. We need to get going again. 11, 12. Finally, they can't handle it anymore. And the leader of this group what is going on? Why aren't these guys getting us going? What's happening? And so he goes over there to confront the men and says, what are you doing? You've wasted away most of the day. You're just sitting here. One of the men spoke up and he says, we're waiting for our souls to catch up with our bodies. We can be so busy and so consumed and we work so hard. What do we do to wait for our souls to catch up with our body? What is the ambition of your life? Do you have a career or a calling? Do you care about possessions or a purpose? Do you feed your flesh or your faith? Do you build your mansion or your mission? Are you worried more about your image or your identity? Do you spend more time fighting with your family or fighting for your family? Do you live a life of leisure or do you live a life of love? What are the ambitions of your life? What do you give yourself for and over to? What is so important to you? What do you strive and struggle for? What consumes your thoughts? What consumes your time? What consumes your checkbook? Is it the things of God? Or is it the things of yourself? Are you serving yourself or are you serving the King? Which is it for you? So as we close and think about this series, the whole trip, I hope that there was a little nugget in each one of these, but what is your sense out of all of this that we've discussed? Your sense of all this encouragement to step up your faith in some area. What does that look like for you? And more specifically, what is God calling you to? Our two questions. What is God saying to you? And what are you going to do about it? Is it an issue of faith? Is it an issue of speaking up? Is it an issue of taking ownership and leadership? Is it an issue of humility and presenting your heart to the Lord? Is it this issue of surrender and selfishness? What is one area where God would call to you and challenge you? And that this year, you're going to turn up that heat a notch, walk closer with him and serve him better. Let's pray.